This is the easiest way to make ribs on a pellet grill, and you don't even need a thermometer. Just follow this method and your ribs will turn out perfect every time, as long as you avoid one fatal error that will completely ruin them, but we'll get into that in this video. Let's get smoking. Let's start with 2 racks of St. Louis style spare ribs. This method works just as good for baby backs, I just prefer spares. I'm wiggling a spoon under the membrane on the back of the ribs to get it to lift off a little, and then I'm pulling the membrane off with some paper towel for extra grippiness. You could also just score the membrane with a knife or leave it on. It's not going to make a huge difference. I just compete in barbecue competitions where everything needs to be perfect, and sometimes the membrane doesn't fully render and it can become a bit tough and papery, so I like to take it off. Now I'm spritzing the back of my ribs with some water and pulling out some Let's Go general purpose BBQ rub. This rub was made for ribs in particular, and I highly recommend it. It's linked in the description section below. After a nice coating, I'm pulling out some Smoke Trails BBQ brisket rub, also linked below. I made this for brisket, but it also adds some nice texture and color to ribs because of the pepper, sumac, and other ingredients. Now I flip the ribs over and rinse and repeat on the other side, trying to coat everything as evenly as possible, and look at that. Some nice color and texture. That's exactly what we want. I'm going to leave these guys on the counter for 15 minutes now to soak up that rub. Heading outside to my Camp Chef Easy Bake Oven pellet pooper, I'm admiring my ribs again, and you can see how the rub has dissolved and fully integrated into the meat. That's why we let them rest on the counter beforehand. I'm placing 1 rack of ribs on the upper rack and another rack on the bottom rack because I want to show you how placement affects the ribs during the cook. By the way, I'm using smokin' pecan pellets for this cook because they are the smokiest pellet on the market, and pellet grills need all the help they can get. These are made from pecan shells, which are very high in lignin and consequently produce a ton of smoke. They are linked in the description section below if you want to try them out, and I highly suggest you do. My Camp Chef is set to 225 degrees Fahrenheit, and I'm setting it to maximum smoke. I've tried all kinds of temperatures with this method, and I found 225 is the optimal temperature on a pellet grill cooking ribs on the top rack and without changing the temperature for the entire cook. Now we wait for 3 hours. That's the 3 part of the 3-2-1 method. 3 stands for 3 hours unwrapped. And now the ribs look like this. Nice red color, the rub is set and stuck to the meat, and you don't need a thermometer for this, but I just want to show you what's going on here. If you're cooking on the top rack at 225, the ribs will probably be around 165 degrees internal at this point. The ribs on the bottom rack, however, will be much higher at around 175 to 180 internal. And if we look at an infrared thermometer, I want to do this for illustrative purposes, we can see that the top ribs on the bottom are 165 surface temperature, which is perfect. They're cooking really evenly. But the bottom ribs are 180 to 190 surface temperature on the bottom, much higher. That's because the steel drip pan right below the bottom rack absorbs a ton of heat from the burn pot, and then it transfers it to the bottom rack through radiant heat. Radiant heat is the enemy of low and slow cooking, and it's the reason that a lot of people have issues cooking on a pellet grill when they're cooking things like brisket and pork butt and ribs. They tend to burn it on the bottom because they're cooking on the bottom rack. The reason that happens is because of the radiant heat from the deflector plate. Luckily though, radiant heat dissipates according to an inverse square the further you get away from that heat source. So by the time we get 6 inches away from that bottom grate to the upper grate, we're looking at maybe 1/36 of the radiant heat intensity as that bottom rack is experiencing. So it's an easy fix, guys. If you're doing low and slow cooking like ribs or pork butt or brisket, use the top rack. And if you're doing direct heat grilling or searing, use the bottom rack. Okay, now we're moving on to the 2 part of the 3-2-1 method. At this stage, I'm laying down 2 sheets of extra wide aluminum foil. Get the extra wide stuff, it's basically essential. Then I'm laying down 5 or 6 slices of butter. Let's call it 2 cups worth of butter, and laying the ribs on top of the butter, meat side up, bone side down. We want the meat side up because the meat side down will cook a lot faster and wash off more of our spices and bark. Now I fold the edges over the ends of the ribs, being careful to leave some slack on the edges so the bones don't poke through the foil. And then I fold the long edges over the ribs and crimp them to seal them tightly, so we have kind of a little packet of ribs that we can easily unfold and fold repeatedly. Now here's the big mistake people make when they use the 3-2-1 method. They think that the 2 stands for 2 hours wrapped in foil. They just blindly leave it in the foil for 2 hours and then they unwrap it at the end of that 2 hours. And it's often overcooked and really mushy and fall apart, and sometimes even inedible. Or in other circumstances, it could be tough as a hockey puck and not cooked at all. This is basically why everyone in the barbecue community hates the 3-2-1 method and considers it kind of a relic of the past that they wish would go away. But unfortunately, a lot of people, i.e., Probably you are searching on the internet for the 3-2-1 method because they've heard of it somewhere. So it's not going away, and that's okay. We just have to tweak it a little bit. And here's the tweak. The 2 in 3-2-1 does not stand for 2 hours. It stands for take them to tenderness. Take them to tenderness. Now, I just made that up, obviously, but it has to be that way in order for this method to work. It's not gonna work any other way. We need to add some discretion into the method. When you wrap ribs in foil, they start braising and steaming in their own juices, and they cook very, very quickly. There's probably only a window of maybe 10 to 15 minutes during that wrap phase when the ribs are perfectly done. Any earlier than that, and they're too tough. Any more than that, and they're overcooked. So it's extremely hard to just say, hey, just leave them wrapped for 2 hours or 3 hours, because it depends on how much collagen and fat are in the ribs, how thick the ribs are, whether they're baby backs or spares, whether you're cooking on the bottom rack, which has more radiant heat, or on the top rack, or in an offset smoker, because usually you're cooking from the top down, it's a bit colder underneath the ribs, so you have to cook at a higher temperature usually. There's more evaporative cooling in an offset smoker. There's just too many variables, so take them to tenderness. To do that, after 1.5 hours, I unwrap the ribs and I check them for tenderness. 1.5 hours is kind of my magic number that I've found that works really well, because that's normally when the ribs start hitting around 200 Fahrenheit internal. 1 hour is too short for the ribs to really start braising in their own juices, and 2 hours is usually way too long and they've overcooked. So I found 1.5 is usually the sweet spot to start checking for tenderness. I'm checking them by sliding some tongs underneath the ribs. These tongs have silicone tips. They're not just metal that's gonna poke through the ribs. And I lift them up so that they bend. We want them to bend almost 90 degrees and for the top of the ribs to start tearing slightly. Some bone pullback that you can see here is also a good sign. These are actually pretty close after 1.5 hours, but they're not quite there. If they're still bouncy and stiff, they need more time. We're also looking for the muscle fibers to shred easily when you poke them with a fork. If they don't tear apart easily and they're still bouncy and they snap right back into place when we poke into them, they need more time. So wrap them back up and keep cooking for another 15 minutes. 15 minutes later, I'm checking again, still not done, but this is good now because I'm getting an idea of what the toughness feels like, so I'll understand what tenderness feels like when I get there. Another 15 minutes later, you can see how the top is tearing slightly. That's a good sign. The muscle fibers are tearing easily and they're not just snapping right back into place. And it's bending almost 90 degrees, but it still holds together. It's not falling apart completely. You should almost be thinking, oh man, if I cook these a little bit longer, then they're probably gonna fall right apart, and next time I lift them up, they're just gonna snap in half. That's usually a good sign that they're done. Now, the ribs might be absolutely perfect after 1.5 hours, or they might need 2 or 3 or 4 periods of checking them every 15 minutes. Every rack of ribs is gonna be a little bit different, but it's essential that you keep on checking them every 15 minutes for tenderness. Again, take them to tenderness. Moving on to the last step, the 1 in 3-2-1, which means 1 hour unwrapped out of the foil. I unwrap the ribs and place them on the top rack. Keep those foil pouches though, with all the butter and juices in them. We'll use them later when we're slicing. Now I'm slathering the ribs with some barbecue sauce at this stage. This last hour is not going to cook your ribs much more at all. They should have been completely cooked to tenderness during the wrap stage, and if they're still a bit undercooked, another hour isn't going to fully cook and take your ribs to tenderness. You're gonna need a lot longer than that. This last hour is just to tack up the sauce on these basically finished ribs. An hour later, the ribs look like this. The sauce is nice and sticky and tacked up. You can see I put the foil packet on the bottom grate here for the butter to stay melted. We're gonna use that shortly. Here's the ribs on the cutting board. Nice texture, nice color, sticky tacked up sauce, a bit of bone pullback. Decent looking ribs. To slice them, I'm dunking them in all the butter and meat juices from the foil packet that we saved. This just adds a nice fatty layer on top of the ribs and makes them taste better. Then I'm flipping them over so I can see the bones. I'm slicing them into individual ribs. Here's a look at one of them. Nice bark, super juicy. How does it taste? Oh yeah, that's a tasty rib. Perfectly tender, nice bite through texture without completely falling off the bone. Really good rib. So in conclusion, 3 hours unwrapped at 225, then wrap them and take them to tenderness, and then 1 hour unwrapped at the very end with some sauce on them to tack up the sauce. That is my take on the 3-2-1 method, but what do you guys think of it? Let me know in the comment section below, and until next time, happy smoking.